Good afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining this webinar today, Doing More with Less, the Benefits of Quantitative Risk Assessments, brought to you by Acuity Risk Management in collaboration with the Institute of Risk Management. My name is Sanjay. I am the Director of Training for the Institute of Risk Management. But before I hand over to my colleagues from Acuity, just to go through a few kind of housekeeping things or a bit of info about the webinar. So the webinar is scheduled to run for an hour. We have left a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A, but if we do overrun slightly, that's not a problem. We will try and finish on time, but we may overrun for a few minutes, but we have the capacity to do that. The webinar is being recorded, so if for any reason you have any connectivity issues or internet problems, first you might want to exit the webinar and rejoin. That sometimes solves the problem, or otherwise, you'll have access to the recording post-webinar. Now, you're going to have the ability to ask questions throughout the webinar. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see an area where you can type in questions. Now, we'll try and answer these during the webinar if we can, but anything that we can't answer, we'll try and cover in the Q&A session at the end. Now, we're going to be running some polls during the webinar, and you will also have a survey at the end of the webinar. We'd encourage you to participate in these if you can, because it helps us kind of interact with you and also get a better understanding of what you've liked or haven't liked during the webinar for the survey. There are also some handouts that we've made available for you, so you'll be able to download those during the webinar. Okay, so that just leaves me to hand over to Simon Marvel and Doris Cosima from Acuity. So Simon's going to be presenting, and Doris is going to be helping him with the questions. So I hope you enjoy the session. And Simon, over to you.
Sanjay, thank you very much for the introduction. Welcome everybody to the webinar, Doing More with Less, Benefits of Quantitative Risk Assessments. My background is initially 20 years in risk management consultancy, 13 years of which was with a firm called Insight Consulting that I founded. And we specialized in information security, business continuity, and enterprise risk management. And then in 2005, I founded Acuity with a couple of colleagues. And we have a software platform for GRC and governance, risk and compliance and integrated risk management called Stream Integrated Risk Manager, with a particular focus on cyber and enterprise risk. The agenda for today, following this brief introduction, is just to talk about the nature of risk in the digital era. The world is increasingly complex, chaotic. We're seeing unprecedented levels of change at the moment happening very quickly, and at the same time, organizations are transforming to digital, which is giving rise to increased digital risks, many of which are material. I'd then like to talk a little bit about what do we think good looks like for risk management in the digital era, and we'll just run a quick poll at that point and get a little bit of feedback from you. And then I'll go on to talk about practical quantification of digital risk. And I sort of emphasize the word practical here because qualitative heat maps have been around for a very long time. They're very widely used. They're easy to understand and they're easy to use, even though they have some quite serious limitations, I think, when it comes to digital and cyber risk. But to really be beneficial, any sort of quantitative approach to risk assessment must be usable widely, I think, within an organization. Therefore, it must be relatively easy to use. And so I want to focus on the sort of practicalities of quantification of risk when we get to that point. I'll then draw it to a close with summary of benefits, my recommendations as to how you might go forward, and then we'll leave time at the end for questions and answers. So just moving on then to risk in the digital era, the world is being transformed by new technology. What was gathering pace before the pandemic has accelerated during the pandemic. And last year, I noticed that PwC reported from a survey that 82% of CEOs think that digital transformation is strategically important, and importantly, were willing to invest in it as well. The analyst IDC was forecasting $7.4 trillion to be spent between 2020 and 2023 on digital transformation, and the World Economic Forum is estimating economic value creation of $100 trillion over the next decade. And that's coming from the changing in customer expectations, how businesses are reacting to enable those changed expectations, and it's going to change the way people live and work over the next decade. And so unsurprisingly, businesses are rushing to try and exploit the new opportunities from digital, and also to try and protect themselves. There's the fear of disruption by smaller tech-enabled, faster competitors that might come and disrupt the market. So there's an awful lot going on around sort of digital transformation at the moment, and that of course brings in digital risks and cyber risks. And I noticed this report from Deloitte in 2019. It's called Transformative Change, Disruptive Risk, about the future of risk in the digital era. And the report highlighted a number of new risks or changing risks in the digital era. And it's a good read, actually, this report. I recommend it. And I won't go through all of those that are listed here, but just pick out a couple with some examples. So at the top left there, managing the black box of artificial intelligence and the difficulty of in seeing what's going on. And an example that Deloitte gave was a healthcare program where there's a backlash because an algorithm reduced patients' benefits for no apparent reason. And a similar example of an organization that pulled its ads from a website because the AI algorithm was placing them alongside inappropriate content. Second example was in evolving governance and controls for automation. So robotic process automation is really accelerating in manufacturing. This itself needs new controls. There was an example here of an automated process in an assembly line that didn't have the appropriate quality controls addressed as part of the change to robotic processes, which resulted in reduced product quality and increased costs. And then the final one, just to highlight, is protecting against the changing cybersecurity risk landscape. So these days, our homes, our cities, our infrastructure, medical devices in our bodies, even sometimes the toasters in our kitchen are connected and enabled. We're increasingly seeing automation, so AI, botnets, Internet of Things, both to facilitate and to protect against cyber attacks. So it's really important that we continuously revisit cyber risks and controls. And I'd just like to try and illustrate that a little bit further, and just sort of talk about the characteristics of cyber risk, and in particular the fact that it's a continuous risk. It's not a one-time risk. It's not a project risk that finishes when the project is over. If we're running a digital service, then it's an ongoing operational risk. And try to illustrate that, then organizations have business goals. They seek to achieve business objectives and targets. They use critical business processes to facilitate that. And those critical business processes depend upon critical and sensitive data, information assets, and also other assets such as applications, networks, devices, and so on. And over time, things happen that have the effect of increasing the risk of us achieving our business objectives. So all those arrows pointing upwards are increasing the risk. So the emergence of new threats, the increase in level of threat, the emergence of vulnerabilities, they're critical, exploitable vulnerabilities. These all have the effect of increasing risk. Incidents, while they themselves don't necessarily increase risk, they shine a light on the fact that perhaps we're at a higher risk than we thought we were. And then controls can fail, controls can be missing, and that also has the effect of increasing risk. So over time, things happen that can increase the risk, but similarly, we can take action, or things might change which will reduce the risk. So we can remediate critical vulnerabilities. The threat might itself reduce. We can address weaknesses in controls or control failure that have been identified during audit or penetration testing, for example, that sort of thing. And we can implement new controls to address new risks. So this means that over time, our risk changes. It goes up and it goes down. And if we understand our tolerance for risk, then the likelihood is that at certain points we'll be below our tolerance for risk, and at other points we'll be operating above our tolerance for risk. And so the question then is, well, what does that actually mean? Well, if you're operating above your tolerance for risk, then the chances are that the frequency and or the severity of loss events, data breaches that cause impacts, either in aggregate or possibly even individually, is going to be intolerable to the business. And if that's the case, then the impact of that is that we're likely to see our costs escalating above budget. So if we're having unplanned incidents, we have to respond to those. We incur costs, perhaps direct financial costs, perhaps reputational damage, perhaps legal, regulatory costs, reporting costs, and so on. And all of that can actually end up taking our expenditure above our budget. And similarly, if that's happening, and particularly if we're having reputational damage, and that manifests itself in increased churn of customers, for example, or difficulty in recruiting new customers, then what we can see is that our achievement of our business objectives drops beneath target. And there was quite an interesting example to sort of illustrate, which was the Equifax data breach in 2017. This was a very serious breach of personal data. It actually happened in the US, but it affected UK and European customers of Equifax. And this was in 2017. And in 2019, in their accounts, Equifax took an $83 million charge for security transformation and a $690 million charge for legal and investigatory costs. And they reported a $556 million hit on profit. So profits were $500 million down on what they would otherwise have been. So I don't think, given that sort of circumstance, that it's unreasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that actually operating above your tolerance for risk for any length of time is a leading indicator that potentially our costs are going to escalate above budget, and that our business performance is going to fail to live up to objectives and will fall beneath target. Okay, so I think it's quite important to try and make that point as far as digital cyber risk is concerned. Another point I just wanted to make as part of the introduction was approaches to cyber security. And I think, generally there's a problem with cyber risk management. We're seeing increasing losses. We're seeing increasing frequency of events. We're seeing some very severe events and sometimes existential cyber-related events. And sometimes we have to ask ourselves, well, why is that? And I found this report from McKinsey from, I think, early 2020 or late 2019, based on a survey that they'd done, McKinsey, the global management consultants. And they found that most organizations these days are taking what they call a maturity-based approach to cybersecurity. So this is all about building capabilities for cybersecurity, often sort of following really good guidance, so from the likes of NIST in the US and so on. But it's building capabilities like security operating centers, operation centers, identity and access management, implementing multi-factor authentication, application monitoring, and so on. The problem with this is that it tends to result in everything being applied to everything. So suddenly all applications are getting some level of of application monitoring. And this, if we're not very careful, can result in unmanageable growth where spending escalates and we get implementation gridlock because the relatively scarce technical resources that we've got that are able to implement these solutions are completely overstretched. McKinsey reported dashboards permanently stuck on amber, and the question, does it actually really reduce risk? And there are lots of other reports around, compliance and approaches to compliance not actually reducing risk. So what do McKinsey recommend? Well, they recommend that advanced organizations are going to move to a risk-based approach to cybersecurity, and this is focused on reducing enterprise risk. So it's identifying and prioritizing the controls that are going to reduce risk. And it's about aligning our digital risk management with enterprise risk management frameworks and the business's overall tolerance for risk. It's about focusing on the high risk applications and implementing a pragmatic program to try and keep risk within tolerance. And as we go through, we'll see that this sort of approach really needs a quantifiable approach to cyber risk. One final slide on this, and that is that McKinsey also did some comparisons of cost and expenditure across organizations that take a maturity-based and a risk-based approach. And this is illustrative and extrapolated, they say, but they identified that costs in all areas can reduce with a risk-based approach, but particularly in the area of technical controls applied to non-key assets and to the whole area of cyber risk management and governance. And they had some fairly broad sort of estimates, but they sort of found a sort of ratio of 5 to 14, if you like, in terms of cost between the risk-based approach and the maturity-based approach. And their strong conclusion at the end was that by taking a risk-based approach, we can get better security for lower cost, and therefore that's got to be something that we ought to be interested in. So the next part of the presentation was, well, what does good look like? And if we're going to be talking about quantitative risk, then what are we really hoping that it's going to deliver for us? And these are my suggestions on good risk management outcomes. If anybody disagrees with these or has any additional suggestions, feel free to add them into the chat, and perhaps we'll be able to pick up on them a little bit later on. But my first one really is that a good outcome is that we're resilient to loss events. We can't avoid losses and breaches, but we want to make sure that they're within tolerance. And that means that we need to reduce the frequency and the severity of loss events and incidents down to a level that's acceptable. And we certainly want to avoid a catastrophic impact that has an existential impact on the business. We also want to make best use of our resources by targeting them at the highest risks and putting the effort into addressing those risks that's in proportion to the level of the risk, hence the importance to be able to quantify the risk. We want some validation that we're getting, that we're getting value for money from our security budget, so that we're applying the right controls to the right risks. We want to be able to cost justify new investments. We spend an awful lot on security, and how do we know whether it's effective or not? And increasingly, there's pressure on budgets. We need to be able to justify expenditure in security. So does the cost of the solution, is it justified in terms of the potential cost saving to the business in terms of reducing the frequency and severity of incidents? We want priorities and decisions to be risk informed. So if we're considering a new digital service, then what are those risks, and are they tolerable? and if not, what do we need to do to make them tolerable? What are the key actions? What do we need to do? What do we need to monitor, and so on? And at least then management can make a decision as to whether to proceed with that investment on the basis of being risk informed. And finally, I think it's really important that we continue to optimize and improve and learn. And every organization is different. This is a very complex issue. So the more we can understand what's happening in practice and record that information, then the more that we can use that to our advantage going forward and base our future strategies on what's happened in practice and what we understand from that. And also, I think, in addition to achieving those good outcomes, the board also wants to be communicated with in a way that it can understand. And this is from a survey that the Information Security Forum did, 2019. It's a blog, actually, that they wrote from talking to their members. And they found that the board wants alignment with business strategy. So in the context of the organization's main focus, major projects, global operations, and so on, they want two-way engagement. So they want to be informed, but they want to be able to explore options, ask questions, receive recommendations, make challenges, debate, and then ultimately, hopefully, give approval. They want discussions to be financially focused. They want meaningful information on the costs of cyber investment, the cost of losses, forecasts for the next 12 months. They want empirical data. So they want to be clearly articulated empirical data with sound analytics and demonstrable evidence to back up what's being said. And they also want key indicators, so resilience levels against targets, top 10 risks, what's being done about them, and so on. Okay, so that was a sort of an introduction to, first of all, the nature of digital and cyber risk and how things are changing along with the rapidly changing world in which we're living, and also what I think good outcomes are. And I was really interested, perhaps at this point, just to run a quick poll and just ask you a couple of questions to get your feedback on whether within your organization you feel that you're achieving these good outcomes at the moment. And I recognize not everybody here is necessarily working for maybe a large end user organization, so might be consultants and so on. So again, feel free just to respond based on your experience. But the first one I'm interested in just getting some feedback on is whether you feel that your organization is resilient to loss events, and by that I mean, do you feel that in the future, say over the next 12 months or something like that, that the frequency and severity of incidents and breaches would be tolerable? And again, this is confidential. We're not going to publish any company names or anything like that with this, but it'd be really interesting to just get your thoughts on that. So I'll just give you a few more seconds, as 60% have voted at the moment. Okay, a few more seconds. We're up at 70%, which is a great response. So I'm just going to close that now and share the results. So hopefully you can see the results here. So 32% have said yes, which is great. 14% no, 49% partial, and 5% don't know. So that's an interesting spread. I have to say I was slightly expecting the don't knows to be higher, which is interesting, and there's a fair amount of confidence that organisations have this in hand, which is also great to see. So perhaps I'll just run another one. Gonna close that one, and this time perhaps let's look at this one, which is our new investments are cost justified. And I'm talking about so digital investments, security investments, and so on. So again, if you could pick one of those, that would be great. Okay, we're up 73%. Okay, close it there. And so again, this is showing us strong yes performance. So 55% say that our new investments are cost justified. Only 5% say no, not at all. 27% partial, and 30% don't know. That's great. Thanks very much for participating in that. I hope you found the results interesting. I think we will, when we sort of circulate a follow-up after this event, then we'll summarize those results as well if you're interested in seeing those. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. So now we're going to move on to look at practical quantification of risk, and this approach will apply not just to cyber and digital risk, but to broader operational and enterprise risk as well, if you wish to apply it in those ways. And the good old heat map has been around for a long time. It's used widely, and it's understood, and it's easy to use, and it gives us a qualitative assessment of risk. And it consists of ranking on a red, amber, green matrix the severity and the likelihood of potential loss from a loss event. And it quite often consists of two measurements: an initial assessment, or sometimes people call it an inherent assessment of risk, and then following actions that have been taken or controls that have been implemented, a reassessment of the risk to give us a residual risk. I said it's very easy to use and to understand, particularly where there's a small number of actions that need to be taken to reduce the risk down to perhaps an acceptable level. But digital is quite a lot more complex than that. We have lots of controls that are necessary to be working together to protect against a whole range of different types of threat, which are changing all the time. So we've got this continuous change that we talked about, and this type of heat map isn't really very suitable for addressing that sort of degree of change. Another area where it's weak is in the aggregation of risk, because we can look at individual risks and the controls that are mitigating those risks, but business units want to understand what the aggregate risk is within a business unit, and then potentially the same at regional level and an enterprise wide. Similarly, it could be for business processes, or it could be for different suppliers or parts of the supply chain, and so on. So it's really difficult to aggregate risk with a qualitative heat map type approach. You know, how many mediums make a high? How many highs make a very high? It's almost impossible to have a sensible discussion around that. And then the final area where I think it's particularly unsuitable for cyber is the fact that it doesn't reflect uncertainty in both the severity of loss and the frequency or likelihood of loss. So I'd like to go on to look at that. And when we talk about cyber breach and data loss, then there's a range of potential losses. We can't know for sure. Very rarely we know for sure what the severity of a loss event will be. There's a most likely loss event severity, usually, but it could be lower than that, and it could be higher than that, and in some cases it could be a lot higher. So this is a very typical sort of loss severity distribution curve, and a lot of organizations use this to model their operational risks, and cyber is an ongoing operational risk. And I found a survey actually from the Institute of Risk Management, who we're with today, from 2015, which found that 73% of the participants in that survey were using a log normal distribution for modeling the severity of operational risks. And so this is put forward, and it's used quite a lot in considering the potential range of losses from data breaches. Similarly, there's uncertainty in the frequency of a loss event. So this is another example of a distribution. This is called a Poisson distribution. And 86% of the respondents to the survey said they use Poisson distribution for modeling the frequency of operational risk. So this is showing us that, again, we have a most likely frequency, which in this case I think is 9 by the look of it, within the next 12 months. Again, that period can be varied, but it could be less than that. It could be 8, 7, 6. It could be more. It could be 11, 12, 13, 15, and so on, but with lower probabilities. So this is, again, quite widely used as a way of thinking about the uncertainty that we're facing in both the severity of loss and the frequency of events. And if we assume that these are the sorts of correct profiles, and again, there could be other sort of profiles, then we can combine these together using some statistical modeling techniques, such as Monte Carlo simulation, to generate some quite interesting output and reports. So Monte Carlo simulation, and again, the IRM found that 78% of the respondents used Monte Carlo simulation. So again, very widely used. This randomly takes points off these two different distributions and combines them, and then it looks at the results that were generated, and it plots this sort of report and other reports that can be produced. But this is a very popular one. It's a loss exceedance profile. So it's effectively telling us the probability that we're going to lose more than certain dollar values in the next period, so typically the next 12 months. And we'll look at an example of this in a second. But it picks these points randomly. The more iterations you do, the smoother the curve gets, and the better the understanding of the potential loss profile gets. Okay, so this is, again, a very popular way of making quantitative risk assessments. So just looking at that loss exceedance curve, and this is an example of a report from our Stream platform. What we can see here then is the current loss distribution, and it's showing us, for example, that at a number of data points here, so at this point at the top here, there's an 85% chance that we could lose more than $1 million in the next 12 months. Okay, this point down here is saying that there's a 30% chance we could lose more than $5 million, or there's a 10% chance we could lose more than $3 million in the next 12 months. This is a logarithmic scale at the bottom. So, so it's giving us that sort of probabilistic information. And the really interesting thing is that we can plot against that, which is the dotted curve here, management's tolerance for risk. So if we can understand management's tolerance for risk, and we have some equivalent data points here, then we can see that management would only tolerate a 25% chance of losing more than $1 million in the next 12 months, an 8% chance of losing 5 million, or a 5% chance of losing 3 million. So there's a big discrepancy between management's tolerance for risk and our current risk profile. So the question then becomes one of, well, what do we actually do about it? How can we go about reducing the frequency, the severity of these events, and so on, to get our risk down to below management's tolerance for risk? And again, we'll explore this a little further in a minute. But one other point I just wanted to make, and we were talking about the difficulty of aggregating risk with a qualitative approach. If you take a quantitative approach with Monte Carlo analysis, then aggregation of risk is baked in automatically. You just sample across a much wider set of risks, and you aggregate up. So this is an example. So we may have multiple risks that we've aggregated within France to get this loss exceedance profile. We've got the same for UK, Germany, Italy, and so on. And then that's all aggregated up into a Europe-wide view, and we can compare against the Europe tolerance, Europe's management tolerance for risk. Okay, so this is really a sort of baked into the quantitative approach. And of course, it doesn't have to be a sort of countrywide or regional view. It could be done by business unit, by business process, again, by parts of the supply chain, and so on. Wherever we want to group risks, we want to analyze them, we want to aggregate, then we can apply this type of approach. So I hear you saying he's talked about practical quantification. This all sounds really difficult. How on earth can this be practical? And the answer is that we can make certain assumptions, and we can, I wouldn't say cheat, but we can make things easier for ourselves if we know what to do. And the first thing is, if we assume, either because our data tells us so, if we've got good history of data of incidents and so on, and we can plot on a distribution the cost of those, the severity of those incidents, and we understand the frequency of those incidents, then we can plot a distribution. But if we don't have that data, one thing we could do is assume the distribution, because we know that a lot of these types of risk do follow these types of distribution for severity and frequency. So there's a big caveat, because if these are the wrong distributions, then we're going to get the wrong data out of it. But it's not an unreasonable place to start if you want to take a practical approach. And if we do that, then there are 4 data points that are needed in order to be able to practically quantify risk. And the first 3 data points relate to the severity profile, and they are the lower bound, the upper bound, and the confidence interval for our potential loss. So if, say, we're worried about data leakage, and we've had a number of data leakage events, and we can say that we believe that in 90% of cases, our data leakage loss will be between $1 million and $5 million, for example. Then if we know that, that's sufficient information in order to be able to plot this distribution. Okay. There's a 5% chance that the severity could be less than $1 million. There's a 5% chance that the severity could be higher than 5 million. And there's a very, very small chance that it could be much higher than that. And we have to recognize that there's still uncertainty associated with this. Similarly, for the frequency profile, if we know the most likely frequency, then that's our 4th data point. Okay, so this is what we need if we're going to make these assumptions, and we want to try and simplify things and make them practical. This is the data that we need to understand these 2 distributions. And we need some technology to do that. We need a tool that can actually interpret this data and then apply the Monte Carlo analysis to generate this type of loss exceedance profile. But if we have that data, then we can do it. And if you think back to the qualitative heat map, for each risk, we needed 2 data points. We needed the very low to very high severity assessment, and the very low to very high likelihood or frequency assessment. So you needed 2 data points for a qualitative approach. You need 4 data points for this type of quantitative approach. Okay, so I think that's certainly worth thinking about. Where do we get this data from? Clearly, we've talked about incidents and near misses. If we can build up a history of incidents and near misses, then that's going to inform our understanding, certainly. There's various industry data that's published that could be helpful as well. So these are trailing indicators. And then there's a whole range of potential leading indicators that we could look at. So things like scenario analysis. So we could sit down with business owners for digital services, for example, and we could talk through various risk scenarios, and we could talk through, and again, you'd involve the right people in the discussion, but you'll talk through the potential range of losses. You'd think about all of the different costs that might be associated. reputational impact, the the legal costs associated with it, the compliance, the reporting costs, and everything else, and come up with some sort of view on a lower bound and an upper bound. Clearly, we probably want to, at some point, maybe involve subject matter experts. If we've got threat intelligence, particularly strategic threat intelligence, which is looking broadly at sort of levels of threat for your type of enterprise, organization, so on, that can feed in vulnerabilities and test results. In particular, if we're not remediating vulnerabilities very quickly, not within our sort of policy target times, that sort of thing, then that's an indication that we could be at higher risk than otherwise. So these can all feed in. And then very importantly, controls as well. So the status of controls. And the reason that these are most important are because controls are really the main levers that we have for reducing risk. So if you think about all of these things that have the effect of increasing risk and what we can do to reduce the risk, well, we can remediate weak or missing controls, we can implement new controls, we can optimize our controls and making sure that they're working well. Yes, we can remediate vulnerabilities as well, but for that we need efficient and effective vulnerability management processes, and to me they're also a control. So the metrics that we have around our vulnerability management program are very important also for mitigating risk. And I think what's really important is that we need to integrate controls assurance with risk management, because it's our controls and the assurance that we have in the key controls that are going to keep our risk within tolerance. And just developing on that a little bit further, this is just a simple example of a number of key controls that are mapped onto a threat here of cyber espionage. But of course, it's never a simple one-to-one relationship. So this is very simple, but it's illustrating that there's a key control here, standard configurations, which is important in mitigating risks from cyber espionage, web app attacks, crimeware in this example. And if this is an important control, and not all controls are as important as others, and we need to understand which are our key most important controls, then if that's an important control, and if suddenly this control falls out of its tolerance or its performance levels and is weak, and so if it weakens, then potentially this risk might go from amber to red. This risk might go from green to amber or to red, and we need to know that. We need to be alerted to that situation. So it's not very good to just have controls assurance separate from risk management, where we identify weaknesses in controls, but we don't understand the implication of those control weaknesses on our risks. So we need to look at integrating controls assurance with our risk management, and again, really need a platform to be able to automate that and do that in an agile fashion as things change, which they do all the time. Just one further example, just taking that one step on. Sorry, this is a little bit of a busy slide, but this is looking at those 4 controls that we've just had on the previous slide. And it's, for the purpose of this, then I've just assumed that an audit has found some weaknesses, or some sort of compliance review has found some weaknesses in the deployment of these controls. They're helping to mitigate multiple risks, as you can see here. But if we've undertaken a quantitative risk assessment, if we've mapped our key controls to the relevant risks, and if we understand the importance of those controls, then we can pivot round to look at things from a controls-based perspective, which is what we're doing here. So we're looking at each control. These are all relating to different assets in Chicago banking process, and we can estimate the most likely improvement in risk in financial terms that we could get from improving these controls. So 0% is completely not implemented properly at all, completely ineffective. 100% will be fully implemented, fully effective, and everything else is in between. So this is showing us in this particular example that standard configuration has the potential to give us the greatest reduction in risk. Now you need to bear in mind the uncertainty that's associated with this. So this is the most likely improvement of risk, reduction in risk that we could get in this particular example, but of course it could be lower or it could be higher than this as well. We can also plot the cost of addressing these weaknesses, and we can then look at the ratio between the risk delta and the cost. And if we sort on that, then we get a slightly different order in this case for addressing these particular controls. Okay, it's the same data, it's just been sorted in a different way. So let's just look at that same data back on our loss exceedance chart. So here we've simulated improving these controls, taking action to improve these controls. And so the blue line here is a simulation of what the loss exceedance profile would move to if we took action to address standard configurations and patch management. So the top two, if we just address those in this particular case, this is what our loss profile would look like. If we addressed all four of them, then it would come down to this green line here. Okay, so it's a way of prioritizing, risk-based prioritization of action on controls, and also then visualizing that in terms of a tolerance for risk. And if we look at things in relation to the cost of those security programs, then we can see the sort of return that we're getting and whether we're getting value for money. Okay, one final example before I just sort of start to draw things to a close, and that's cost justifying new investments. You can take exactly the same approach that I've just described with new investments. So one example could be that within different countries in Europe, UK, France, Germany, for example, we're having a number of data loss events across different channels. So email data loss, cloud, via mobile devices, even paper, documents, and so on. So we've had a number of increasing number of data leakages. This is our current risk profile, taking account of the controls that we've got currently in place to mitigate those losses. And this is our simulation of what it would look like if we deployed an enterprise data loss prevention. Now, again, I can't show you just in the time that we've got available how this is done, but this is the output that you get, and it's showing us, for example, it allows us to ask the question, if this DLP solution is going to cost 500,000 a year, then is that justifiable to reduce the risk or the probability of losing more than $10 million from 40% to 5% or less than 5% in the next 12 months. So that's the sort of modeling and data that you can get out of this sort of analysis. So, you know, it's not giving you the complete answer. There is still uncertainty. There's still a less than 5% chance or 1 in 20 chance that we could lose more than $10 according to this analysis. But it's useful information. It's the sort of information that somebody could use as part of making a business case. And certainly, I think, easier than trying to do it with qualitative approaches to risk assessment. The green line again is the risk profile that we could get down to if we took various other actions to improve controls that were weak, but were also helping us to address data leakage. Okay, so let's move on then to just summarize now on benefits. So I really think that this type of approach helps to deliver good risk management outcomes. So I think it improves, I'm sure it improves our resiliency to loss events. We can understand our tolerance for loss events. We can visualize the current risk profile relating to that tolerance, and we can see when we're getting close to management's tolerance. It enables resources to be targeted at the highest risk because it's a risk-based approach as opposed to the maturity-based approach. It helps us to validate our value for money from our budgets for security programs. We can compare the cost of the risk against the cost of the control. It informs the cost justification of investments, and if we're making big investments, which we increasingly are, then I think this provides useful additional information. It enables risk-informed priorities to be set and decisions to be made, particularly around digital transformation and the rapid move towards digital services and so on. I think it's going to give valuable input into that, and it encourages continual optimization and improvement. I think as we get more data, as we see incidents, as we collect more incident data, then we can feed back, if you like, and we can review and we can refine our assessments going forward. So to summarize the benefits, helps to deliver good risk management outcomes. It's a way of aligning with the board's tolerance for risk if the board is setting financial tolerances for risk. It also aligns with the enterprise risk management framework. Delivers improved security at reduced cost through the risk-based, more targeted approach. Continually optimizes as more data is collected, and it builds confidence. Enables better board conversations and allows us to build confidence that risk management is under control. And I think as the world is becoming more digital, the risks to business, the material business risks are increasingly digital. And I think it's important that we think about moving towards an approach to risk management that's suitable for digital. And that means something that's agile and quantitative. So finally, on recommendations, firstly, keep it practical. I've tried to illustrate a practical approach. It involves some assumptions, of course. I don't want to give the impression that it's easy, but I hope I've described that it might be a little more achievable than you might have thought beforehand. Those 4 data points are quite important. You obviously need software platform to convert the data points and to apply the Monte Carlo analysis and to do the reporting and so on. And really, it's not practical to do that sort of thing with spreadsheets. If you try to do 50,000 or 100,000 Monte Carlo iterations on a spreadsheet, you might as well set it running and take the afternoon off. So you need something that's sort of designed for the purpose. Secondly, I think if you don't have the data, start to collect and link data. Collect data on incidents, near misses, link them to risks, to controls that perhaps have failed. Look at collecting metrics if you don't have them around vulnerability management, for example, and so on. Look at integrating controls assurance with risk management, at least those key critical controls, so that where we identify weaknesses in control, we're immediately alerted that risk might be above tolerance, and therefore we can do something about it. Perhaps try it out. Try the quantitative approach alongside the qualitative approach if you're using a qualitative approach at the moment. Perhaps pick an investment decision that needs to be made for a security solution and try the quant approach alongside it. And then if you see the benefits, plan a migration from qualitative to quantitative. So we can't change overnight, clearly. We need training, we need enablement, we'll need specialists to be trained in more detail. But I think there is potential to use this type of approach enterprise-wide if we can keep it practical, and if we can get these sorts of quantitative data and improve them over time, then I think you can get really valuable insights into what's really going on and prioritize your decision making. And as I say, continually look to review and improve. So that's the end of the sort of formal presentation, as it were. There are a few resources I just wanted to point you at. You won't be surprised to hear that Acuity has a software platform that does all of this. I mentioned at the start, Stream Integrated Risk Manager. We provide both SaaS or on-prem solutions, and I've used some example outputs from Stream. But if you'd like to see it in action, if you'd like to understand how it works, then please do contact us, and we'd be delighted to respond on that. This is just a summary of the various use cases from Stream. We've been talking mainly about cyber and IT risk management, sort of touching on enterprise risk management, talking about controls assurance, and so on. Vendor risk management is a very key topic at the moment, and there's another webinar in this series that Acuity is running with the Institute of Risk Management, which I'll give you information on in a minute. But again, if anything there attracts your attention, then please go to the Acuity website, and you'll find a whole host of information there on everything that we've talked about, white papers, whole 25 odd other webinars that you're welcome to watch. There are a couple of resources that are available on the portal. So our brochure or a white paper, I think there's a link to the white paper that supports this series that's on the portal for this webinar. And then this is the next webinar, 30th of September, 2 o'clock UK time. It's the rising importance of holistic third-party risk management, and it'd be great if you'd like to attend that as well. And we'll be talking about third-party risk management. With that, I think we've got a little bit of time left. Sorry, I've taken slightly longer than I'd planned to, but I'll be very happy to now answer any questions if there are any questions. I'm hoping that Doris is going to. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was very interesting, and judging by the questions, everyone's been engaged with the topic. So there's quite a few here. I'm just going to kind of take them as they came in order. So you were talking about how obviously spreadsheets can't really cope with the kind of volume of data that you have to deal with when you do such analysis. And Sajad was asking, actually, is there a specific tool to do such analysis like Monte Carlo, severity and frequency profile?
Yes, well, I mean, our Stream platform does that. So there are other, you can get spreadsheet Monte Carlo analysis tools. The difficulty is just the processing effort that's sort of required to run Monte Carlo analysis. It runs number of iterations. You need probably at least 50,000 iterations to really get a decent distribution out of that type of analysis. But also, I think it's really important to link and have visibility of the relevant data. So you want to be able to see the incidents that you've had. You want to understand the impact of those incidents. You want to understand what are the key controls that are addressing those risks and the health of those controls at any moment in time. So really, for that, you need a platform that's been designed specifically for that purpose, an integrated risk management platform that's designed for that purpose, that's properly user managed, and that has the reporting and the dashboarding that allows you to see aggregate views and report across the enterprise and so on.
Thank you, Simon. Wagner was asking, in your experience, what could be examples of effective approaches to introducing quantitative risk analysis in an organization that insists on saying that it is not mature enough to start using quantitative approaches for risk management?
Well, I try to keep it simple, clearly. I think, and look at doing a pilot project that's trying to do it in one sort of bounded area, and try and make it quite an important area to the business as well, perhaps. And I do hear people say, we're in a type of business that we can't measure everything in financial terms, but I think when you really get to look at it, you'd be surprised at how much can be sort of estimated in financial terms. And the data breach at Equifax that I mentioned, for example, it was the loss of personal data, and there were lots of there was reputational damage there was customer churn type issues and so on. But further down the line, it plays itself out in an impact on the profitability of the organization 2 years later. So I would try and keep it simple, try it on a pilot project, try and get maybe somebody from the finance team that's involved as well, because I think you'll get the backing of the finance team if you're starting to try and do this thing quantitatively. But you can't sort of introduce it in a big bang. And one of the things that we do with our customers is, we have qualitative risk management risk assessment and risk management within our platform as well. And even now, most organizations are still using qualitative risk assessment, but they're starting to go over, and we're seeing much increased interest in quantitative approaches, but they're doing it in parallel. And the platform will support that, and it's try it out, get your feedback, and then look to roll it out if you see the benefit.
I guess that also partly answers another question we have here about how much take up of quantitative risk assessments are you seeing for cyber?
It's increasing this year. Certainly, it's increasing. I mean, we've had this quant capability for 2 years now within our platform. There's always been interest in it. I think it takes a while for these things to really start to get picked up on, but increasingly, in fact, vast majority now of new opportunities that we're talking to, new potential customers, have some interest in quant, and some of them are coming to us specifically for quant. Gartner released a hype cycle report on IT and cyber risk management, which firmly put quant on there. Actually mentioned Acuity, which is really nice. But there's a lot of interest, growing interest, and it's been a lot of people have been talking about it for some time. But there's a real sort of movement, I think, now to start to implement a quant approach.
Thank you. There's also a question here about the quantitative approach being combined with qualitative outputs. So Kieran was asking, should the quantitative approach be used solely, or can this be combined with qualitative outputs to build a better risk picture?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, senior management, they understand heat maps. They recognize heat maps. They've seen them for a long time. So there's no reason that we can't use some quantitative assessment and identify our high risks and those that are above tolerance, and then present them on a heat map, or present them in a way that's easily understandable to senior management. So certainly we could do that. We can clearly sort of triage generally using heat maps. If we want to focus down what are the risks that we think we want to maybe apply some quantitative assessment to, then perhaps we could triage using heat maps and then do a quant assessment as well. I mean, we have the two in the platform. You can actually say, I want to do qualitative, I want to do quant, or I want to do both, and in that case they sit side by side. And it's quite interesting when you do that. Sometimes you get quite different answers, and also when you look at the prioritization of controls. So you can, that report I put up where we got standard configurations and patch management and so on prioritized, you can run that same report both with a qualitative and a quantitative assessment, and sometimes you get quite different priorities. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we've run over time a little bit, so I'll conclude the Q&A here. But all of your questions, if there's any questions that you've had and any questions that we haven't answered, we will get in touch with you after the webinar. So Simon will be addressing your question if we haven't in the live session. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone who's attended. Thank you, Simon, for a really insightful session. I think this topic, like Simon said, is really on the rise in terms of uptake and just people talking about it so much more. I've seen it particularly on social media. Risk quantification is really a topic that's kind of on everyone's lips nowadays, and it's really rising in importance, I think. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you all.